good morning. Thank you once again for joining us on this lovely Sunday morning for our video service. Not a whole lot to go through today, but we'll go through it anyway. The men's group is meeting again on Monday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl or Pastor Carlos know, and they'll get you hooked up with that. Our ladies group is on Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, we'd love to have you join us. You can let myself or Deanne Parodies know, and we can get you on that list. Also, this week, on Wednesday night at 6 o'clock on Zoom, Logos University is going to be kicking off their next class on hermeneutics, which is the Bible interpretation. So if you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl know. We can get the books ordered. There's a book and a workbook, and it's about $50. So if you want to be a part of that, we'd love to have you join us with that as well. Our regular tithes and offerings this week, actually, I think it's Capital Improvements Week, which we're raising money for our virtual wall, which is actually here. We just haven't paid for all of it yet. So you can go online to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, give a one-time gift, give a recurring gift, give to our stage remodel, give to our missions that way, or you can mail a check to the church at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you're not coming back to church yet and you'd like us to swing by and pick up your tithe, we'd be happy to do that too. Just let Pastor Carl or I know. And that's really all I have to go over today. So we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl for his message.
Well, good morning, Father's House. It's good to be with you. Here as we rushed already headlong into the year, we're already the second week into the new year. It just keeps coming and coming and coming, doesn't it? Well, I guess that's the way life is. It never stops. But the alternative could be worse. So I guess we'll just have to kind of go with it, even though we know that life is moving faster, or at least it feels like it's moving faster. Well, I would think the older that you get. So anyway, glad to be back, getting back to normal now with some of our stuff that we're doing. Men's group will be meeting again. I'm excited about that. Logos University, again, with the class on hermeneutics. I'll be back in school starting Monday, and Penny's back on school starting on Wednesday. So life's kind of just going forward. So looking forward to a good rest of the winter and the spring, and I trust that you are as well. Well, anyway, I guess probably without much ado, we probably ought to talk about the topic at hand, what we've been talking about, which is really the idea of the last couple of weeks we've been talking about courage, about the virtue of courage. And I talked to you that I wanted to talk about the virtues, especially I think coming into this new year. And I thought that courage would be especially important to talk about first. And for the simple reason that, we came through 2020 and 2021, and 2021 was in some ways just as hard as 2020 was. And there's no guarantees that because the new year came that this year won't be equally as hard or harder than the last couple of years. And so I kind of thought it important to kind of discuss the topic of courage to start with, this idea of fortitude as we move into the year, because it kind of becomes a stabilizing virtue for us, a stabilizing force. In other words, when we have the virtue of fortitude, when we possess that virtue, when we work on that virtue, then we're not so moved off of center when things happen to us, either good or bad. We have the ability to stay centered because we just have this resilience about us, this steadfastness about us. It's almost like the idea of when Jesus talked about building a house on the rock or building a house on the sand. And courage would be, by way of virtue, it would be like building your house on a rock. We've talked about the other virtues as well, or we will talk about them. I mentioned them. The four cardinal virtues, which would be justice, which has to do with society, temperance, which has to do with moderation, prudence, which has to do with common sense, and courage or fortitude that has this idea of steadfastness in the midst of a storm. So then we're going to talk about the what they call the infused virtues, or the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love through this first part of this year because I think it just sets a foundation for us to build our life on. And what I want to say is that the virtues along those lines become bedrock building principles for us to build our life on. And it's the idea of when we possess these virtues, we don't make as many bad decisions, or we think about what we're going to do before we do it. And so we find that we don't make a shipwreck of our life by taking a wrong turn, or making one bad decision after another bad decision after another bad decision, and think that somehow it's going to end well, when we know that it kind of won't. So just to kind of recap, we talked about 2 weeks ago, we talked about the idea of Simon Peter in the boat and Jesus walking on the water, and the idea of when Jesus came to them and they were in the boat and they were frightened because of the storm. Jesus' first words out of his mouth were, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." And then Peter wanted to walk on the water, and Jesus beckoned him to come. And then as he was walking on the water, the wind and the waves, he started looking at them rather than Jesus, and he sunk, and Jesus saved him. Coming out of the water, Jesus said, "Why did you doubt? Why did you doubt me, Peter, on that one? You should have trusted me on that." So there's this idea within Peter of he took these steps in courage, and also by doing that, having the courage to kind of quelch his fears, stepped out into the water. But when he looked at the circumstances, he found that he didn't have the strength to continue. So we kind of talked about the idea of what does courage look like when it fails? And not that it fell in a bad way for Peter, because it didn't fail in a bad way. It was just one of those things that he had to learn and he had to grow in. But then we talked last week too about Joan of Arc and about some things that she went through and how she displayed herself by way of courage or fortitude as well, even at the cost of her life. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more along those lines. And today I want to talk about a couple of figures. I want to talk about some Old Testament figures, and then I want to talk about a contemporary of our own, although she died in the 40s. I guess you would call her contemporary. When we talk about courage, well, I guess when we look at people that we see that have this idea of fortitude, it helps us to identify what fortitude looks like, what that virtue looks like. And so kind of what happens sometimes, though, is, well, we get looking at these big figures that are bigger than life. For example, when I talked about Joan of Arc last week, I couldn't believe how many people responded to me and to Penny about how much they liked it because it was something that they never knew, and she was this bigger than life figure. Now, one way to put it is she was gangsta. And so she was kind of gangsta in her own way, in a good way. And so people kind of picked up on that attitude about this bigger than life figure of Joan of Arc. So I want to talk about a couple of other bigger than life figures out of the Old Testament. And I want to talk about somebody that many of you, most of you, have never heard about, and what courage looks like in the midst of obscurity, when you're with a bunch of different people, but yet, and maybe nobody's even going to take notice of it, but with inside yourself, you have this node of courage about you. So I kind of want to talk out of the book of Daniel, because I think that out of that book in the Old Testament, we find 4 figures that displayed courage in the face of, and in both these instances we're going to look at with this woman and these 4, when there was governmental pressure upon them and how they stood with fortitude in the midst of that. So if you go to the book of Daniel, you find 4 men that are talked about that are Jews, and they're known as wise men, instructed in the ways of, at that time, of the Babylonian Empire. But they were extraordinary men because they had faith in Jehovah, their God, being Jews. And they never strayed from their faith. And in the book of Daniel, it talks about these men that they were the wisest in all of the land. They were in some ways the fairest of all the land. And when they were tested before the king, the 4 of them shown themselves to be head and shoulders above the rest when it came to wisdom and knowledge and things and such. Well, needless to say, the 4 men I'm talking about there's 3 which there's a story about, which is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the other one would have been Daniel. Now, these 2 stories are interesting because In both instances, when we talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who was also Daniel was a part of this cadre, and they were all friends. There was an incident that happened with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when Daniel wasn't there, where basically they were to bow down to the king's decree and worship the king. And in that instance, the king said that anybody that doesn't bow down, that ultimately what was going to happen to them is that they would be thrown into the furnace and they would be burned to death. Well, so there was this decree that was ordered by the king. And when this decree was ordered, what the three men decided to do is there was no way they could bow down. They knew they couldn't bow down, even though it was the government that wanted them to do it. And the penalty for not bowing down and worshiping the emperor at that time would ultimately be death, or the king would be ultimately be death. Well, they lived by a higher law, and they knew that the only person that they could worship was Jehovah, who was their God. So what they chose to do was to not to bow down. So when everybody else bowed down, they remained standing. And you can imagine the picture when you've got maybe 100 people or 1,000 people all there ready to bow down and worship this king. And there's three men that stand up in the midst and they refuse to bow down. So what happened is in the midst of that, they said, if you don't bow down, you're going to be killed. And they made the statement that, look, we serve God and we only worship God, and we will only worship our God. We won't worship you because you're a man. Long story short, was in the midst of it, they were thrown into the fire. And we know the story there continues that God did save them out of the fire. But there were some statements that were made before they went into the fire. And he simply said, we choose to worship God. And whether we choose to worship, because we choose to worship God, when you put us into the fire, whether God saves us or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is the fact that we're resisting you by way of governmental pressure to bow down to you, even if it costs our very lives. Now, the interesting thing is not the outcome, because the outcome of both them and Daniel, who had a similar circumstance, was that in the case of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were thrown into the fire. There was a fourth figure, which would have probably been a Christophany or an appearance of Jesus, and they weren't burned in the fire. In Daniel's case, God shut the mouth of the lions when he was thrown into the lion's den for a similar thing. But the thing that becomes important in the story is not how it ended, because it could have ended a bunch of various ways, but it ended the way that the Bible tells us it ended. But the important part of this story that I want to bring forward today is not so much how it ended, but how they stood in the midst of governmental pressure to bow their knee and to follow along with the other people that were there in the kingdom. In the case of these three men and Daniel at a later event, they chose to defy the king's edict and to stand alone when everybody else went the direction that the kingdom went, because the other ones knew that it would cost them their life. At the end of the day, what you see in these four figures, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and later Daniel, is the idea of fortitude. That when they were asked to do something that in their conscience they knew would be a sin for them, what they chose to do was to remain steadfast, no matter what the outcome was, on their decision to not worship a foreign god, but to only worship Jehovah, the God that they serve. In the midst of that, there was this idea, and what we can see is we can see this notion of courage by their actions. They weren't shaken. They weren't mad. They didn't tremble. They simply stood for what they believed. They stood there and said, no matter what you say, what you're asking me to do is morally wrong before my God. Therefore, I can't do it. No matter what the outcome is, it doesn't matter. I'm going to stand and trust God as He's the one I worship, and He will be my provision. Whether I live or die, whether the outcome's good or the outcome is bad, I will not be moved. So we see there in the Old Testament, in those scenes, we see this notion on a big scale, don't we? We see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then Daniel, these big stories that have been told for centuries, literally thousands of years. And I would beckon to say that if you've been around a Christian circle for long, that you would basically have heard these stories. And even if you haven't traveled around in Christian circles, you heard the story probably of Daniel and the lion's den, and probably the story of the men in the burning or in the fiery furnace. So those are big stories. Those are bigger than life people that we use by way of an example or an exemplar of what courage looks like. And I think they're good stories because I think that they show us the fabric of fortitude. But with that said, for most of us, that isn't something that we're going to face, is it? We're not going to probably be facing lions or a fiery furnace. Most of us are probably not going to be asked in that way to stand up for our faith against the government, although that could come at a later time with the way that our government could become very totalitarian if we're not careful. The end of the day, though, is what is it that fortitude looks like in the common folk, common people, people that live in obscurity like you and me, that will never be on that large of a world stage. So I thought today, in thinking about who I wanted to talk with, I wanted to talk today about a woman who goes by the name, or lived, and her name was Edith Stein. Edith Stein lived at the time of Nazism. She was born in Poland, and later that became a part of, she basically ended up living in Germany. And living in Germany, she was starting off with, she was a professor at a university teaching philosophy, phenomenology. Later on, she was a Jewish woman, so she left her Jewish roots and she became an atheist for a while. Well, then what happened was she was visiting with a friend and she saw a book by St. Teresa of Avila, who was a Christian mystic that was had some beautiful writings, and she ended up reading a book that Teresa of Avila had written, and she found faith back in God, and she dedicated the rest of her life to becoming a Christian and to following God. Long story short is ultimately she ended up becoming a Carmelite nun with the Carmelites, which are a Catholic order. And she became a nun as her religious faith grew and blossomed. Now, as she was growing, and when she was a Carmelite, she always had I guess you'd say in the back of her mind, she always intuited the idea that one day she may die for her faith. Now, there's a lot of people that would say, I'm willing to die for my faith. But there are certain people, I think, that maybe have the intuition that that's going to be true for them. So Edith Stein, at the time that she was living in Germany, at the time of Nazism, she had a couple of strikes against her. The Nazis obviously had no use at all for the Jews and wanted to eradicate every Jew from the face of the earth. The other thing is that they had grown less fond of the Catholic faith, and they were actually persecuting Catholics, and they were persecuting Christians as well. So there was this idea and this notion with Hitler that that the Jews, the Catholics, or all of Christendom stood against him, which they really did, because of what they were doing to the Jews and the aggression and the injustice of what Nazism really was and what its actions were. So what happened was she was living as a Carmelite, and she had really a couple of strikes against her living in Germany. She was a Jew and she was a Christian. So what they decided to do was they decided that it wouldn't be wise for her or her sister to live there. So they decided and arranged for their sisters to move to another monastery, Carmelite monastery, they were both nuns, in Holland. Well, the story kind of picks up in Holland when they were there that the Roman Catholic magistrates that were there in Holland decided to become critical of Hitler. And so as they became critical of Hitler and what Hitler was doing, eventually the Nazi regime wanted to come down hard on the Catholics because they were speaking out against the evils of Nazism. So what they decided to do was they decided to go into the Catholic communities, and especially into the monasteries, and into the churches, and take away their leadership and take away the people that were Christians and that were Jews and take them to concentration camps in Germany. Well, in the midst of this, when they raided Holland and did that, Edith Stein and her sister were called out when they came in with a knock on the door at the Abbey where they were living and said that they particularly wanted those two to come with them. And this is where the story gets interesting, because when they left the convent where they were, and as they were leaving, there was a certain calm on both of them as they were led away, ultimately to be put in trains and to go to the concentration camp. Well, the interesting thing about the story of Edith Stein is the notion and the idea that in the midst of what was going on, she knew she was going to die, or she had this premonition that she was going to die as a martyr for the sake of Christ. And so on their journey, which took several days for them from the time they left Holland and they arrived in Auschwitz. In those days that preceded that, there were these people that were being gathered up that ultimately would meet their death in Auschwitz just not many days from there because of the anger of the Germans. What happened is that as these people began to become to these centers of deployment where they would put them on trains and they would take them, as they all met, there was despair on the people that were there because they knew they were going to concentration camps and they knew it wasn't going to be good. In the midst of that, most of the people were frazzled. They were just taken back. But what the accounts are of people that knew Edith Stein and other people that didn't know her, but then ultimately that she stood out to them, was the idea that in the midst of all of this frenzy, there was this calm about her. That when mothers were in such fear, and fathers as well, that they just kind of ignore their kids and what was going on around them because of this fear, they were almost just paralyzed. But what Edith Stein did was she took it upon her to care for those people, no matter who it was. Whether it was the children, she would groom them. She would make sure that they were clothed properly. She would change their clothes if they needed to. She would encourage the parents and the adults that were there. And one man that was a German observer actually looked at her and just noticed that in the midst of this, there was something in her eyes that was later related that was divine, and the calmness that was extraordinary to all the people that were there. Needless to say, what happened was she was put on to these trains that was going to Auschwitz, her and her sister, and they went to Auschwitz, and they were there just a couple of days until finally the Germans led them into the gas chambers and killed them by way of gas, ultimately burned their bodies and left their remains there in a grave. In the midst of that, the interesting thing is not the outcome of what happened to Edith Stein, because she was a devout woman. It was the way that she handled herself in the midst of that. In the midst of this chaos, think about it. All these people being uprooted from where they lived, families now on this journey with their kids, not knowing what was awaiting them, but knowing that they were headed to the concentration camps where the rumors were that once you got there, life was brutal. In the midst of all of that, when people are frantic, being uprooted from everything that they own, the way of life that they had, the homes that many of them even grew up in, they were being taken by force to a place where they knew the ultimate destiny could have been death. Edith Stein, in the midst of that, displayed fortitude, courage. She wasn't moved by what was happening. She wasn't afraid of what it was that awaited her. As a matter of fact, she never really paid much attention to herself at all because she was too busy comforting those in fear and those that didn't understand what was happening. You see, that's what the virtue of courage looks like. That no matter what the circumstance, no matter what predicament you might find yourself in, it's the idea of fortitude, knowing and trusting that God is with you and you'll make it through it. It doesn't mean you're going to make it through well, meaning you're going to live or not, because in this case, Edith Stein died as a martyr, both as a Jewish martyr and as a Christian martyr. But in the end of it, it was the stance once again. The virtue of courage always remains unmoved by its circumstances. You catch that? The virtue of courage always remains unmoved by its circumstances. In other words, circumstances doesn't move courage because courage is something that can't be touched by circumstances. It lives in some ways above the circumstances, beyond the circumstances. It becomes in us when we develop it and grow it, a steadfastness that no matter what happens, no matter what comes our way, we're not going to fear. We're not going to be paralyzed by what it is that's there, that we're going to stand with fortitude. I'm not saying that's easy to do. I'm not saying it's something that we do and perfectly all the time, but it is something that God wants us to grow in. He wants you to grow in it, and He wants me to grow in it. God's not looking to take us out of difficult situations. God's taking to use difficult situations in our life to develop this virtue of fortitude, of being able to stand in the midst of pressure. Whenever we run away from pressure, we're running away from an opportunity to grow in courage, to grow in fortitude, in steadfastness. When things get tough and we say we're bailing out, we're going somewhere else, we're doing something else, then what we're ultimately doing is we're missing the opportunity to become a kind of person that Edith Stein was, just before the hours of her death, comforting other people, not even looking at her own circumstance. At the end of the day, Edith Stein went to her Lord, not by way of fragmented fear, but by way of this concrete sense of the virtue of fortitude. I guess that's something that we've got to develop in ourselves. The question today is, are you willing to embrace circumstances to grow in this or not? Now, we're not automatically strong in this virtue of courage. It's something that we have to be trained to be able to respond to. It's almost like the idea of a child. A child, when they first deal with a stressful situation, it might be something that's very small to us, but it's large to them. But as time grows, what happens is, and our courage grows, our fortitude grows, that when stress comes upon us, when we're put into it, eventually we can handle more stress and more stress and more stress and more stress because we find a fortitude inside of ourselves, a steadfastness within inside of ourselves. That's what God wants us to do. He wants us to grow in that way so that no matter what comes our way, we'll stand on a firm foundation and not be easily moved. I don't know what's coming for us in our future as Christians. It could be good, it could be bad. The chances are, as the world dislikes Christians more and more, I would think that the day will come when fortitude would be a virtue that we want to have and be able to stand in when the tide of public opinion is against us. Oftentimes it is. If that's the case, there's nothing that will ever replace the gift of fortitude, the virtue of fortitude. So today, as we get ready to close, I hope you'll think about it a little bit more. You'll ponder the idea of what it means to be strong, courageous, standing, firm, no matter what storm comes against you. Because in those ways, even if we live in obscurity, we find this gift and this virtue of fortitude invaluable in every circumstance. God bless you. Have a great day, and I look to talking with you again soon.